Hello. In this video, I want to talk to you about tools for financial management. In prior videos, I have discussed the goal of financial management and also some of the challenges to that. I suspect that after going through those, you may be second guessing your abilities to be effective financial managers. I may have taken something that seemed like it should be pretty straightforward and made it appear to be a daunting challenge. However, the good news is that there are a relatively small number of tools that are regularly employed to help with financial management, and that's quite frankly what the balance of this course will be about. But at this stage, what I want to do is to have you sort of at a very, very high level gain an understanding of what those tools are and how they fit into solving the problem of financial management. I know that you'll probably know a lot more about this by the end of the class, but this is a way to sort of create an organizing context for you at the beginning of the course, so that as you're going through stuff and you're thinking, "Tell me again why I need to know this," we can tie that back to, "Oh yeah, because this is an important tool in helping me with financial management of a business." So the objective here is very simple. Let's acknowledge that businesses do make use of a number of tools to assist in managing their financial health. I list these as forecasts of operating cash flows, time value of money concepts, cost of capital concepts, and capital budgeting techniques. For each of those, you should be able to provide a brief description of what that tool is and then provide an explanation of how it can be used to aid in the financial decision-making process of a firm. All right. So again, you can put this in a business context and think of a situation where you might be either asked to do an analysis or be presenting an analysis, and you start talking about a particular step in the process of your decision making, and you'll have questions about, well, why did you do that? What's the whole point of that? You'll want to train people on how to do this, and it's important to provide them sort of a big picture context. And so that's what I'm hoping that you're able to do by the end of this objective. So let's first talk about the forecasts of operating cash flows. We have spent a lot of time in the prior two videos talking about operating cash flows. Recall that at the end of the day, they are simply the cash receipts from sales, the cash payments out for operating expenses, the cash flows from purchase or sale of assets used in the course of operations. Obviously, if it's an asset purchase, that's an outflow. If it's a sale, you sold an asset off, that's an inflow. And so for any period, if it's a month, is your period is defined as a month, then that's your 1 month operating cash flows. If it's what is it, 6 months from now, then you can do this for 6 months out. If it's 3 years from now, then you would do it for 3 years out. It would be equal to your sales less your expenses, plus the money you raise from asset sales minus the money you spend from asset purchases. That's your operating cash flows, period. In order to understand, remember that ultimately we want to grow the value of our business, and we think that we do that by growing the operating cash flows over time. And so we make business decisions that we think will grow that. And so in order to understand what the consequences of a business decision is, we need to understand the range and timing of the operating cash flows that go with that business decision. So that's why we develop forecasts. So generally, when we develop these forecasts, we'll develop them in the form of scenarios. And we might start with something we might call our likely scenario or most likely scenario. And then we might develop a best or worst case. We might develop some other scenarios in between that. But the key here is that it's the forecast is not a single number. It is intended to be a range that gives you some flavor of how much uncertainty there is as you go out in time. It should be incremental. So the operating cash flow forecasts are incremental in the sense that they reflect how the operating cash flows will change as a result of taking the business decision. If we are taking on a new business opportunity, the change is all the cash flows that come from the business opportunity. If we've already got a business opportunity and we're thinking about making adjustments to it, the incremental cash flows would be the difference between what the cash flows are by taking the decision versus what they would be if we don't take this decision. And keep in mind that it's important that your forecasts not only reflect the level of the cash flows, but also the timing of them, because whether a cash flow occurs now or 5 years from now can make a big difference in how it impacts the value of the firm, of the business. All right. So if we again go back to that, the purpose of the financial management is to manage the operating cash flows and capital costs of a business, then it's important to know what our expectations are about the future cash flows. Those expectations are usually based on some set of assumptions about how the future might unfold, and the technique and the tool of developing operating cash flow forecasts is a way of translating those assumptions into estimates of cash flows. And so there's a process that you go through where you will embed those assumptions into a calculation that will say, well, based on that, that's going to impact the business in a particular way. And so here's what I would expect to be the resulting change or outcome in terms of operating cash flows. And so it's important for us to understand that what we're actually starting with are not assumptions about the cash flows themselves. We're talking about assumptions about how the future may turn out, right? And we work through a process that translates those assumptions into the cash flows. Now, I'm going to say this several times throughout the class, but this will be the first time. For any one forecast, so whether that's your most likely, your best, or your worst case, whatever your scenario is, for any one forecast scenario, the probability that the future turns out exactly like you forecast is approximately zero. There's almost no chance that you are going to be spot on for every period over a course of say 10 years in terms of revenues, expenses, all of that sort of stuff. But the probability that your forecast range, so somewhere between your worst case and best case scenario, captures what actually happens is probably pretty high. And in fact, the probability that it's somewhere near your most likely may be pretty high. And I think as you gain more experience in this and in the industry that you're doing it in and that sort of stuff, that most likely may become a better and better predictor of how things actually turn out. Keep in mind that as it relates to this, if you were to adopt a business opportunity, how the future turns out is not simply a random draw from the hat of the future. Your business will be set up to manage to try to achieve these cash flows or something better than them. And so it's there is a bit of interaction over time where your folks inside your business are trying to make the forecast come true. And so that works to your favor as opposed to everybody just kind of sitting back and saying, well, let's just see what happens. All right. Second tool is the time value of money concepts. Time value of money as a term is often used to describe two different kinds of tools or concepts that we use: present value and future value. Present value is as of today, or a particular point in time that we're standing in, that's, let's just say, is the today for the context of what we're doing, the present. What would all of the cash flows that are going to happen in the future, what would their dollar value today be? It embodies the concept that if we had, let's say that we could have a cash flow of $1,000 10 years from now. Well, if we thought about how much money we could have today that would be worth $1,000 10 years from now, we might look and say, well, um, you know, that value, if we had let's say that we had some amount of money, $500, but we put it into investments for 10 years, it might grow to $1,000. And so we really only need a $500 today to get the same $1,000 a year from now. So we would say that the present value of that $1,000 is $500. Future value would be just the opposite of that. It would say, if I had $500 today, what's it going to be worth in 10 years? And so we would look at what we think the return on the investment we would put it into is, and based on that, we would say we reckon that that $500 could grow into $1,000 in a year. So this notion of present value and future value is intended to define some relationship between the value of money today versus the value of money in the future, so that we can get to a value over time. The most important feature for our purposes of the time value money concepts is that I can pick a date. So I can pick a week from now, let's say, or today, and I can look at a set of cash flows that have been projected out for the next 10 years. And I can use the present value concepts to figure out what the present value of each of those cash flows are, sum them together, and so I get the sum of the present values of all the future cash flows. And that is the value of this decision today. And so it allows us to not have to make judgment calls about different patterns of cash flows over time. It allows us to reduce them down mathematically into a single number and use that number. And so that's very powerful for us. Remember that the ultimate goal of financial management is to grow the value of the business by growing operating cash flows over time. Present value of future cash flows from a business or a business opportunity is, by definition, the value of the business that we're talking about growing. And so time value of money concepts are very important, not only in figuring out what the value of the business is as it is today, but figuring out whether or not the pattern of cash flows that we'll have into the future adds to that value or subtracts from that value. And so it's a central tool in helping us to figure out whether or not the present value of the business is going to be improved or not improved by our business decision. Next concept is cost of capital. We've talked about before that the cost of capital is just the cost that you would incur in terms of paying for the money that you need in order to invest in the business. And remember, you could get that money either from lenders or from equity investors. And so the cost for a lender is the interest payments that you have to make. The cost for an equity investor, recall that what they want you to do is to add cash flows to the business over time that cause the value of the business to grow at some minimum acceptable rate over time. Maybe that's 5% a year, so they want the value of the business next year to be 5% larger than the value of this year. And so that implicitly turns into a cost of capital. And you can state that in either dollar terms or percentage terms, but basically it's the same thing. It's people who have money saying, if you want to use my money to invest in your business, here's what it's going to take in order for you to get my money. Now, how is that cost of capital related? In the approach that we will take to making financial decisions, we already talked about that we are going to want to determine the present value of things. And I think I talked to you about this notion that you know the relationship between a cash flow that happens in the future and what its present value will be has something to do with some rate of return, or what we call the discount rate. When you're talking about a value in the future and bringing it back to the present, we call that discounting, and we use a rate for that. And the theoretically correct interest rate, if you will, to be used in that is a rate that coincides with your cost of capital. And so we can't do a proper calculation of the present value of the firm without having as an input not only those operating cash flows, but the cost of capital for the firm. And if we have that, then we can do a proper present value calculation. So we can do one of two things to get to the cost of capital for a firm. If we actually are in the process of negotiating with investors, we can use that information to help us determine a cost of capital for the incremental investment. If not, there are some techniques that we can use to help us estimate what the likely cost of capital from investors would be, or what the reasonable cost of capital will be, to help us make our decisions. And so, there's a whole set of theory around that. Anyway, the bottom line is you can't do the present value calculations to get to how a business decision impacts the value of the firm without having a discount rate. And the discount rate you have to use is the cost of capital. And so you have to have the cost of capital to make it all work. The last thing is capital budgeting as a tool. It's a term that we use to refer to both a process and a set of techniques used to make decisions about whether or not invest in business opportunities. Usually, capital budgeting as a technique consists of, a particular capital budgeting technique would be defined by a metric that you are supposed to calculate in a particular way as it relates to a business decision, and then a rule that goes with that metric that basically says, if the value of the metric is this, it's a good decision and you should go ahead and make the investment. If the value of the metric is not this, it's not a good decision and you should not make the investment. So that's basically the way those work. And remember that our financial management is ultimately just a series of decisions that we make about investments or changes to the firm and how those will affect the value of the business. And since capital budgeting provides us with a consistent framework for knowing what values to calculate and what decisions based on you should make based on how those values turn out, it's nice because it both guides us in our analysis. Instead of sort of sitting there and saying, okay, I'm supposed to make this decision, what should I look at? I have absolutely no idea where to start or what to do. It speaks very directly to what you should do, and not only what you should do, but once you have that, how you should make a decision, how you should use that piece of information to make a decision. The real benefit of this for most firms, quite frankly, is that it really, I'm going to say, reduces the impact of personal biases. And it's generally shown that companies that use sound capital budgeting techniques have a track record of making better, financial decisions than those that don't. That does not mean every decision that they make is better, but it does mean that overall they tend to make more appropriate financial decisions than they do bad decisions. And so we believe that having these frameworks is useful. I'm just going to pause here for a second. The caveat that I would put into this point about it reducing personal bias is this. Because all of this relies on assumptions that get translated into forecasts, it is not possible to completely eliminate personal bias in this valuation just by virtue of these tools. That's why we tend to have multiple people involved in both developing assumptions and forecasts and going through this process. And we tend to create sort of a separation of responsibilities, a check and balance, if you will, in the process, so that the people who would have the ultimate say on whether or not we go forward with a decision are not the same people that are heavily invested in coming up with these numbers. Part of the reason for that is that we want to make sure that there is an independent mind viewing the assumptions and the cash flows and so forth that can question these and try and remove some more of the personal bias. And so, again, it's all aimed at trying to get to something that is a good objective view of the range of how things might possibly turn out. I can't say that it completely eliminates the bias, but it certainly helps. And that is all we have as it relates to this. Keep in mind again that the context of this is that I would like you to understand at the outset. We're gonna basically cover each of these tools as its own discussion module, if you will. And it would be nice at the beginning of this, before we even get into it, that you have somewhat of a roadmap of how all of this fits together. And we will keep checking back on this at this level and make sure that you're still remembering how each of these modules and what we cover in that fits into the big picture. Hope you find this useful. Thank you.